Magnus Carlsen was leading at the halfway stage of the World Chess Championship, but it was clear from today's game that he didn't want to take his foot off the gas. Both players showed that they were extremely well prepared. This was a Berlin defence of the Spanish, and, well, after 25 moves of the game, they were still following a previous game in this line. But it was soon clear that Carlsen understood this endgame much better than Anand. Now, this is the position after 28 moves, and you can see that Carlsen is a pawn down. He's sacrificed a pawn, but his pieces are very active. What he would like to do here is perhaps manoeuvre his knight into e4 or h5, and then perhaps bring the bishop round to h4 to put even more pressure on this pawn. And for the moment, Black's pieces aren't very well placed at all. There's certainly no counterplay with his queenside pawn majority. This rook is poorly placed on g6. Anand thought for almost a half an hour in this position on just one move, and he came up with knight e5. Now, one thing is that if knight e4, looking at both these pawns, then knight d7, now that's quite a nice regrouping from Black's viewpoint. Now Black, with the knight on d7, is a lot more secure. So instead, Carlsen chose to check, and then he took on e5, which forces pawn takes bishop, and then rook h5. Now you can see that Carlsen would like to take the pawn on e5, and that will leave him with two connected pass pawns. Excellent winning chances. So it looks pretty bad for Black, but in fact Anand had prepared a line here. He sacrificed his bishop. And so they've reached an endgame with Black having rook and 4 pawns against White's rook and 2 and knight, but all on the same side. So only Carlsen has winning chances here, but Black is very solid. Now, they manoeuvred for the next 20 odd moves, and in principle nothing much has happened. I think Carlsen was trying to tire out Anand, and there's very little that's changed in the pawn structure. But it's here that Carlsen started to make some progress. He played c4. Now his idea is to support the knight coming to the d5 square, and then he wants to manoeuvre his rook down to the 7th rank to attack c7, and this is dangerous. Now for the moment Anand just waited with his rook, just keeping as active as possible. So here's Carlsen with this manoeuvre. The knight comes around now, and it's ready to come into d5. And it's here that Anand decided that he should react. He went active with b5. And after knight c3, c6. So obviously this prevents the knight coming to d5, but there is a drawback. That after, you can see the knight coming into e4, and it's hitting, well, as well as the rook, the pawn on c5. So that pawn is vulnerable. On the other hand, having played the pawn up to b5, Black's king now has a route into White's position to gain counterplay against White's pawns. This needs exact calculation. So let's have a look at what happened in the game. Knight d7, and the king came out. Now, for example, if the knight comes back to e5, then Black has to switch on here. Retreating the king, well, it's going to be disastrous because the rook comes here and hits c6. So the king has to go forward, giving up a pawn. Anand had calculated all this, that's quite clear. And now Black threatens to gain counterplay with rook checks. So the rook has to come back to defend, and now rook g3. And Black has sufficient counterplay here, hitting the pawn on b3. So Carlsen played rook e4. And there were some checks. So basically what Anand is doing with these checks is dragging the king over as far away from the queenside pawns as possible. Carlsen has to do this with his king. He finds no shelter on the queenside, but it means that the king's being dragged away from these pawns, so that now b3 is a bit more vulnerable. So good play from Anand. And now this is an excellent move, b takes c4. You could play king b4 straight away, but as both players appreciated, Anand explained afterwards, he didn't like this check. The king has to go back, and then rook e8, and this could be rather uncomfortable. Still not absolutely clear, but Anand didn't like this. Instead he took on c4. This is an accurate move, and if pawn takes, then the king now the king comes in, and that's very different, with pressure on this pawn and also counterplay with the a pawn. Black is fine there. So rook takes c4 and rook g3, pressurizing the pawn on b3. So knight takes c5. So Carlsen has won one of the pawns. He's won a pawn back. But here black has superb pressure. Again, it's all to do with the fact that this king is miles away. If this king was, stationed somewhere like a3, it would be very different. But Anand cleverly checked the king as far away as possible first. And there's a problem for white. There's now a threat to play rook takes pawn and take the rook. So the rook has to retreat. And now a5. And white is tied up here. The knight can't move because of rook takes pawn. The rook can't move away from protecting the knight. The only thing that white can possibly do here is try to bring the king closer to the queen side. But it's very hard to do that, because if, for example, king d2, then rook g2 check. Exchanges rooks, and then the knight hangs. So, well, king f2 is really the only try from white. But the rook remains active. And now king b4, and now the king comes over. But Anand found rook c3, excellent move. And if the rooks are exchanged, then this is a clear draw. In this position, well, if the king moves away, then obviously the knight is en prise, and if the knight comes back, then a4 will liquidate all the pawns in the position. So basically, yeah, Anand is getting rid of all the pawns. Carlsen checked with the knight, and king takes pawn. That's the last white pawn gone, and this guarantees a draw. Now, this is move 77. In fact, Carlsen played on until move 122. He did succeed in capturing both these pawns and played on for a bit with rook and knight against rook, but I'm going to spare you the details of that endgame. It's actually very easy for black to draw, and Anand really showed no difficulties at all. So, after over 6 hours play, the game ended up in a draw. Actually, I thought this was a really good game today. Perhaps it wasn't the most spectacular game of the match, but from the quality of chess, it was very high. Carlsen tries to squeeze blood out of a stone, but Anand defended really perfectly. So, Carlsen still leads. They play their next game tomorrow, Tuesday, and it'll be very interesting to see what kind of effect this long game has on both players. See you tomorrow.